The alarm did not sound like alarms are supposed to sound. It was quiet, almost polite, a soft chime that rippled through the council chamber like a stone dropped into still water. But every head turned toward it, because we all knew what that chime meant. A human ship had entered our system without warning, and no one in that room had ever seen one before. I was standing near the high window when it happened, my hands folded the way I had been trained to hold them since I was young, calm on the outside no matter what churned beneath. My name is Calith Vess, and at that time I served as a junior voice in the Council of Aeldoran, a world that had stood for longer than most stars keep their light. My people do not rush. We do not raise our voices. We had lived through ages that turned other civilizations to dust, and we had learned patience the way a river learns its bed, slowly and without complaint. Humans, we were told, had none of that patience. They were a young species, barely out of their own cradle, quick to anger and quicker to grief. Some of the elders called them fireflies, bright and brief and gone before you could learn their names. I did not disagree with them then. I had never met one. The ship that entered our system did not fire on us. It did not run. It simply held its position at the edge of our defense line and sent a single message, spoken in our own language, though clumsily, like a child reciting words it had only just learned. We come to speak, not to take. That was the first thing Elias Marr ever said to my people, and I was in the room when the translation played aloud, and I remember the silence that followed it, thick and uncertain, because none of us had expected humility from a species we had already decided was beneath patience. He arrived 3 days later, escorted onto our home soil under heavy guard, though I would learn much later that the guard was more for our comfort than for any danger he posed. He was young by our measure, which meant nothing, since humans measure their whole lives in the time it takes one of us to grow past childhood. He stood in the receiving hall in a plain dark uniform, no decoration, no display of rank, and he bowed to the council the way our own nobles bow to each other, which told me he had studied us far more carefully than we had studied him. I was assigned as his liaison because I was fluent in the trade tongues and because, frankly, none of the senior council wished to spend their days with a human. It was seen as a small task, almost beneath notice. I remember walking into the guest hall that first morning, expecting to endure a few weeks of awkward translation before he was replaced, or recalled, or simply gave up and went home. He did not give up. Within the first week, Elias had already begun to speak our formal tongue, not the trade language, but the old court speech that even some of our own younger nobles struggled with. When I asked him how he had managed it so quickly, he told me that his people had a saying, that a guest who does not learn the house's language has already decided not to stay. I found that strange and interesting all at once, because it suggested a kind of humility I had not expected from a species we considered reckless. We spent long hours together, walking the outer gardens while he asked questions about our history, our laws, our customs of marriage and mourning and war. He listened in a way that unsettled me, because he did not simply wait for his turn to speak, the way most negotiators did. He actually absorbed what I told him, and sometimes he would return to a conversation days later with a question that showed he had been turning my words over in his mind the whole time. I asked him once why his people had sent someone so young for such an important task. He smiled at that, a strange human expression that I did not yet know how to read, somewhere between amusement and sorrow. Because we do not live long enough to waste our young years waiting to be trusted with something important, he said. If we wait until we are wise enough by your measure, we will already be old, and there will be no time left to use what we learned. That answer stayed with me longer than I expected it to. The negotiations themselves were slow, as all things are slow among my people, and Elias endured them with a patience that surprised the council more than any weapon could have. He did not push. He did not threaten. When one of the elder counselors insulted his people openly, calling them short-lived and unworthy of true alliance, Elias only bowed his head and said that a flower does not need to outlive the mountain to be worth planting. It was around that time that I began to notice something changing in myself, though I did not have a word for it yet. I found myself listening for the sound of his footsteps in the garden hall before I saw him. I found myself saving small observations through the day, thinking, I must tell Elias this, before I remembered that I did not need to explain my whole life to a foreign diplomat. There were others among my people who noticed it before I did. My own kin warned me gently, then less gently, that whatever closeness had grown between us was inappropriate, unwise, even dangerous to my standing. Humans do not last, they said. You will watch him wither while you remain unchanged, and what good will come of loving something so brief? I did not have an answer for them then. I only knew that when Elias spoke of his home, of a world I had never seen, full of short, bright lives lived at a pace that seemed almost frightening to me, I did not feel pity for him. I felt something closer to wonder. The turning point came during a formal banquet marking the anniversary of the First Contact Treaty. There was an incident, a small one, nothing that would be remembered by history, but it changed everything for me. A rival delegation, envoys from a neighboring system who had never trusted humans and resented their sudden rise among the stars, attempted to humiliate Elias publicly, mocking his species' short lifespan in front of the entire court, suggesting that any alliance with humanity was a temporary and foolish gesture, like befriending a candle that would soon burn out. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself with anger, though I could see, in the tightness of his jaw, that the words had found their mark. Instead, he stood, faced the rival envoy directly, and spoke words that I have never forgotten. You call us short-lived, as if that makes us small, he said. But a star does not need to burn forever to light a sky. My people burn brightly because we know our time is limited, and that is not our weakness. It is the very reason we do not waste it on cruelty toward guests who have done nothing to deserve it. The hall fell silent. Even the counselors who distrusted humanity most seemed to have no answer for him. I remember looking at him in that moment and understanding, with a clarity that frightened me, that I did not simply respect this human. I had come to care for him in a way that went far beyond duty. It took many months after that evening before either of us spoke openly of what had grown between us. There were customs to consider, politics to navigate, an entire council that would need convincing that a union between their liaison and a human emissary was not some grave mistake, but rather the strongest possible symbol of the alliance both our peoples needed. Elias proposed to me in the same garden where we had first spoken, kneeling in the human custom he had explained to me weeks earlier, holding a small object he called a ring, a simple band forged from metal his own hands had shaped, since he said he did not trust anyone else to make something meant only for me. I do not know how many years I have left to walk beside you, he told me, kneeling there beneath the pale light of our twin moons. My people do not measure time the way yours do, but however long it is, I want to spend every day of it choosing you, not because a treaty demands it, but because I have never known anyone who makes me want to stay in one place as much as you do. I said yes before he had even finished the sentence, which he later teased me about for years, claiming I had ruined the moment with my impatience, a trait he found endlessly amusing given how patient my own people were said to be. The wedding, when it finally came, was unlike anything my world had witnessed before. We combined our customs, a joining ceremony under our ancient rites, alongside the simple vows his own people practiced, spoken first in his tongue and then in mine. Many of the elder council attended out of duty rather than joy, still uncertain that this union was wise. But there were also many, especially among the younger generation, who watched with something like hope in their eyes, as if they understood, even before I did myself, that what was happening in that garden was larger than two individuals choosing each other. It was the first true bridge between our worlds, built not from treaties and trade agreements, but from something far harder to manufacture and far easier to trust. I remember the weight of the ring on my hand as we exchanged our final vows, and I remember looking out at the gathered crowd, human diplomats standing beside my own kin for the first time without the careful distance that had marked every meeting before. Elias took my hand and smiled at me in that quiet, steady way he had, and I understood then that whatever difficulties lay ahead of us, Whatever doubts the council still carried, we had already done something that no treaty could undo. We had chosen each other, freely, in front of both our peoples, and in doing so we had proven, more clearly than any negotiation ever could, that our two worlds were capable of becoming something greater together than either could ever be alone. I did not know then how short our time together would truly be, or how the very qualities that made Elias remarkable, his courage, his patience, his refusal to hide from difficulty, would one day place him directly in the path of a danger neither of us could have fully imagined on that quiet evening in the garden. All I knew, standing there with his hand in mine, was that I had never felt more certain of anything in my long life. I was married to a human, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was glad that some things could not be measured by how long they lasted, but only by how deeply they were felt. Life after the wedding did not become simple, no matter how much I had hoped it would. I had imagined that once the ceremony ended, once the council had witnessed our union with their own eyes, the difficulties would fade the way morning mist fades from the garden stones. Instead, a new kind of difficulty began, quieter than before, but no less real. Elias moved into my family estate, a place built from pale stone that had stood for centuries before either of us was born. He adapted to it with the same patience he brought to everything, learning to sleep beneath our low ceilings, to eat food that our physicians had carefully adjusted for his different body, to walk through halls where servants still lowered their eyes when he passed, unsure whether to treat him as a guest, a lord, or a curiosity. Not everyone welcomed him. There were council members who spoke to me privately, urging me to reconsider, suggesting that the marriage, however symbolically useful, would eventually become an embarrassment once Elias aged in ways my own people did not. They spoke as if love were a calculation, as if I should weigh the short years ahead against the long years I would spend afterward, alone, and decide accordingly. I did not have patience for such conversations, though I kept my voice level whenever I ended them, because that was the only language my people respected. Elias, for his part, never let the coldness of others wound him where I could see it. Only once, late in an evening when we sat together beneath the twin moons, did he admit how it truly felt. "They look at me and see an ending," he said, turning a small carved stone over in his fingers, something he did when his thoughts grew heavy. "They do not see a person. They see a countdown." I told him that I did not see a countdown when I looked at him. I saw someone who had chosen, against every comfort his own world could offer, to stand in a place where he was unwanted by many, simply because he believed the alliance between our peoples was worth the discomfort. He smiled at that, though it did not fully reach his eyes, and he told me that this was, in fact, exactly the kind of thing his people considered worth doing. "We die too easily," he said, "so we learn early that most things worth having are not safe, and most things safe are not worth having." I began to understand, over those months, that his people carried an entire philosophy built around impermanence, one that my own culture had never needed to develop, because we had never been forced to. Where my people planned across centuries, humans planned across decades, sometimes across mere years, and yet somehow this made them more decisive, not less. Elias explained it to me one evening while we walked through the lower gardens, where the old stone bridges crossed still water full of pale fish that had lived there longer than either of us had been alive. "If you know your time is limited," he said, "you stop waiting for the perfect moment to act, because you understand there may never be one. You act while you still can, and you accept the outcome, whatever it becomes." I told him that such thinking seemed dangerous to me, reckless in the way my people had always described humans. He laughed softly at that, a warm sound that had become one of my favorite things in the world. "Maybe," he said, "but it is also how we win conflicts we should have lost, and how we build things across 10 years that took your people 10 centuries to imagine building at all." I could not argue with that, because I had seen it myself. In the short time since first contact, human ships had already reshaped the balance of power across several border systems, not through greater numbers, but through a willingness to take risks that older, more cautious species like mine would never have considered acceptable. It was this same trait, this fearless urgency, that had first drawn the attention of the neighboring empire that had long resented humanity's rapid rise among the stars. I remember the evening Elias first told me about that empire in detail, sitting across from me at the long table in our private hall, his expression more serious than I had seen it since the day of our wedding. He explained that they called themselves the Thren Dominion, an old and proud civilization that had held uncontested influence across a wide stretch of space for longer than my own people had kept written records. They had watched humanity's sudden arrival among the stars, with open hostility, viewing the newcomers as an insult to the order they believed governed which species deserved to rise and which deserved to remain small. They tolerated the treaty with your people because it was convenient, Elias told me, but they never accepted it, and they certainly never accepted us. I asked him if he believed there would be trouble, and he did not lie to me, which was one of the things I had come to trust about him most deeply. He said that he believed it was not a question of if, but when, and that when it came, humanity would very likely be asked to stand at the front of it, since we were the newest, and in the eyes of the Dominion, the most disposable piece on the board. That should frighten you, I said. It does, he admitted, but it also tells me exactly where I need to be when it happens. I did not fully understand what he meant by that at the time, though I would come to understand it with painful clarity later. For now, in that quiet season of our early marriage, we allowed ourselves moments of simple happiness amid the growing tension. We spent evenings teaching each other games from our separate worlds, mine involving careful strategy, played across a board of shifting stones, his involving cards and quick decisions that rewarded boldness over patience. He always won at his own games, and I nearly always won at mine, and we teased each other endlessly about what this proved regarding our different natures. There was one evening, quieter than most, that I have returned to in memory more often than any other. We sat together on the balcony overlooking the eastern hills, watching the light fade from gold to violet, and Elias told me, without any particular reason, that he did not regret his posting here, not for a single day, even with everything he now understood about what might be coming. I could have stayed home, he said. I could have taken a safer assignment somewhere quiet, finished my service, grown old surrounded by people who understood me without effort. Instead, I chose the hardest posting available, on a world where I would need to earn every ounce of trust I received, because something told me it would be worth it. I asked him if it had been worth it, and he turned to look at me with an expression I will never forget, warm and certain and entirely without doubt. Every single day, he said, even the difficult ones, especially the difficult ones. It was during this same season that the first reports began arriving of unusual activity along the border shared with Dominion space. Nothing dramatic at first, simply patrol patterns shifting, communication channels growing quieter than usual, small signs that any experienced observer would recognize as the early motion before a larger storm. Elias, given his dual role as both emissary and now unofficial liaison to the Joint Defense Command that had formed between our peoples, was among the first to see the full reports. I watched him grow more focused in those weeks, not fearful exactly, but purposeful in a way that reminded me he had always been, beneath the gentle diplomat I had fallen in love with, someone trained for far harder duties than garden conversations and formal banquets. He began spending long hours with our defense council, translating human tactical doctrine into terms our own commanders could understand, since human strategy, built around speed and calculated risk, differed sharply from the slower, more deliberate approach my people favored. One evening he returned late, exhaustion written plainly across his face, and I asked him, gently, whether he believed our two militaries could truly work well together when the time came. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Your people move like a fortress," he said. "Patient, strong, difficult to break, but slow to shift. My people move like a storm, fast, unpredictable, willing to accept losses that would trouble your commanders if it means securing an advantage. Neither approach is wrong, but learning to combine them, that is the hard part. I asked him if he thought we would have enough time to learn it properly before the storm actually arrived. "I hope so," he said. But hope has never stopped a threat from arriving early. Those words settled into me with a weight I did not fully appreciate until much later. In the meantime, our life continued, filled with the small rhythms that make a marriage feel like a life rather than an arrangement. We disagreed occasionally, though rarely about anything serious, mostly about small things: how loudly he laughed during formal dinners, how long I took to answer questions he considered simple, whether his cooking, which leaned heavily on flavors my people found overwhelming, was truly as wonderful as he insisted. We made promises to each other during that time that I still carry with me. He promised that no matter what duties called him away, he would always find a way to return to me, even if only for a single evening between assignments. I promised that I would learn to understand his world as thoroughly as he had learned to understand mine, so that whatever time we had together, neither of us would ever feel like a stranger to the other. Neither of us could have known then how soon those promises would be tested, or how completely the quiet, uncertain peace we had built together was about to change under a pressure neither our fortress nor his people's storm could fully prepare us for. The message arrived on an ordinary morning, which is somehow the detail I remember most clearly, because I have always believed that terrible news should announce itself with some kind of warning. Instead, it came quietly, delivered by a young officer whose hands trembled slightly as he presented the sealed communication to Elias at our breakfast table. Elias read it twice before he set it down. I watched his face carefully, the way I had learned to over our years together, searching for whatever truth lay beneath his calm expression. When he finally looked up at me, I already knew, in the way one knows a storm has arrived even before the first drop of rain touches the ground. "The joint colony at Varen Hold has been struck," he said quietly. Both human and Doranai settlers were present. The Dominion moved without warning, without any declaration, exactly the way we feared they might. I asked him how many had been lost, and he told me the numbers were still being confirmed, though early reports suggested the losses were significant. I asked him what this meant for us, though some part of me already understood the answer before he spoke it aloud. "They are calling me back to active service," he said. "Not simply as an emissary this time. The defense fleet needs someone who can translate strategy between our peoples in real time. Someone who understands both doctrines well enough to make split-second decisions when communication delays could cost entire formations their chance to respond correctly." I felt something cold settle into my chest, a feeling I had never experienced before in all my long years, because my people had never needed to send someone we loved directly into danger with so little certainty of return. I asked him if there was any way to decline the assignment, knowing even as I asked that the question was unfair to him, that he had never been the kind of person who could turn away from a duty simply because it frightened him. He did not answer the question directly. Instead, he reached across the table and took my hand, the way he always did when he wanted me to truly hear what he was about to say, rather than simply listen to the words. "I have spent years building the trust that makes this alliance function," he said. "If I step back now, when it matters most, everything we built together becomes hollow. I am not asking you to be at peace with this. I am only asking you to understand why I cannot say no." I understood. That was the terrible truth of it. I understood completely, and understanding did nothing to ease the fear that had already begun to take root inside me. The days that followed passed in a strange blur of preparation and quiet desperation. Elias spent long hours in briefings with the Joint Command, reviewing star charts and fleet formations, memorizing protocols that would allow him to coordinate between vastly different command structures under conditions where a single miscommunication could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. I attended what council sessions I could, arguing for greater support to be sent alongside the defense fleet, though my voice, however senior it had become since my marriage, still carried less weight than I wished it did against the caution of elders who preferred to observe rather than commit fully to a fight not entirely their own. There was one evening, 3 nights before his departure, that I have returned to more often in memory than almost any other moment of our life together. We sat in the garden, where he had first proposed to me, beneath the same twin moons that had witnessed our wedding, and for a long while neither of us spoke at all. Finally, Elias broke the silence, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "I need you to know something," he said. "Whatever happens out there, I do not regret a single day of choosing this life with you. Not the difficulty, not the doubt from your counsel, not any of it. If I could choose again, knowing everything I know now, I would still choose you, every single time." I told him that such words felt too much like a farewell, and I asked him, my voice breaking in a way that my people rarely allow themselves to break, not to speak as though he did not intend to return to me. He held my face gently in his hands and told me that he intended to return more than he had ever intended anything in his life, but that he also believed in speaking the truth of his heart clearly, while he still had the chance, rather than assuming there would always be another evening to say it later. "My people do not speak of love as freely as yours do," I told him. "We consider it a private thing, something felt rather than declared." "Then let me be the one who declares it," he said, "because I have never been very good at keeping quiet about the things that matter most to me." On the morning of his departure, I broke from the customs of my own upbringing entirely. I did not simply offer him the formal farewell that tradition demanded, a composed bow, a measured wish for safe travel. Instead, standing before the assembled officers and my own startled kin, I told him plainly, in front of everyone, that I loved him, using words my people reserved only for the most private of moments. The startled silence that followed was broken only by Elias himself, who smiled at me with an expression of such open joy that it seemed to erase, if only for a moment, the fear that had gripped both of us since the message arrived days earlier. "I love you too," he said, "and I intend to prove it by coming home to hear you say it again." He boarded his transport shortly after, and I stood at the landing platform long after the ship had vanished into the sky, watching the empty space where it had been, as though staring hard enough might somehow bring it back into view. The weeks that followed were the longest of my life. I threw myself into council work, into every task that might occupy my mind and keep it from wandering toward the front lines where Elias now served. I received brief messages from him when the communication delays allowed, short and careful, since he could not share operational details, but full of small observations meant to remind me of the man I had married. He told me about a young human officer under his command who reminded him of himself at that age, eager and slightly reckless. He told me about a particular strain of ration food the fleet had been issued that he found genuinely unpleasant, and he complained about it with such humor that I found myself laughing alone in my quarters, grateful for even a small distraction from the constant weight of worry. Then came the evening before what would become the largest engagement of the entire conflict, a battle that would later be known simply as the Stand at Meridian Pass, named for the narrow stretch of space where the Joint Fleet had chosen to make its defense against a Dominion force many times its size. I received one final message from Elias before communications were restricted for operational security, and I have read it so many times since that I could recite it perfectly even now, though I will not, because some words are meant to remain private even in the telling of a larger story. What I will say is that the message ended with a promise, the same promise he had made to me in the garden days before his departure. He told me that whatever happened in the hours ahead, he intended to come home, and that he was fighting not simply for the alliance between our peoples, but for the chance to sit with me again beneath the twin moons and continue the life we had only just begun to build together. I did not sleep that night. I sat instead in the observation chamber of the council hall, where sensor reports from the front were relayed as quickly as our systems allowed, watching numbers and formations shift across the display with a growing dread that I could not shake no matter how firmly I tried to steady my breathing the way my people are trained to do. Somewhere beyond the edge of our system, in the cold dark stretch of space known as Meridian Pass, the man I loved was preparing to stand against a force that had already proven itself willing to strike without warning and without mercy. I did not know, sitting there in that quiet chamber, that I was about to witness the single most devastating moment of my long life, played out not in whispered reports or careful summaries, but in real time, across a sensor feed that would show me everything, whether I was ready to see it or not. The first reports came through just after the local dawn, though dawn meant little in the enclosed observation chamber where I had spent the entire night. The Dominion fleet had arrived at Meridian Pass in numbers far greater than our scouts had predicted, a wall of dark vessels stretching across the sensor display like a shadow spreading over still water. Our combined fleet, human ships arranged in their quick, layered formations alongside the slower, heavily armored vessels of my own people, held their position at the narrow point of the pass, the only place where the Dominion's greater numbers could be forced into a bottleneck narrow enough to give us any chance at all. I recognized Elias's assigned vessel on the display, a mid-sized command ship called the Halcyon, positioned near the center of the human formation where his coordination between fleets would be most needed. I watched the small marker that represented that ship with an intensity that made my eyes ache, as though watching closely enough could somehow protect it from what was coming. The engagement began with a coordinated strike from the Dominion's forward line, testing our formation's response time. I listened as officers around me called out shifting positions, adjusted defense patterns, relayed updates in clipped, urgent voices that echoed the tension gripping the entire chamber. For the first hour, our combined defense held remarkably well, the human ships moving with a speed that caught the Dominion forces off guard, weaving between heavier strikes in ways that our own vessels, built for endurance rather than agility, could never have managed alone. Elias's voice came through the command channel more than once during that early phase, calm and steady despite the chaos surrounding him, translating tactical adjustments between the two fleets with a clarity that allowed formations to shift in unison rather than falling into the confusion that might otherwise have doomed us within the first hour. I heard pride in the voices of the officers around me as they acknowledged his instructions, and for a brief, fragile moment, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps this battle might be won without the cost I had feared. That fragile hope did not survive the second hour. The Dominion commander, recognizing that a direct assault through the pass was proving costlier than anticipated, shifted strategy, sending a smaller but heavily armed strike group around the flank of our formation, aiming directly for the civilian evacuation convoy that had not yet cleared the system. Thousands of settlers, both human and Doranai, remained aboard those transport vessels, families who had fled the earlier strike on Varen Hold and were still awaiting safe passage to a secure system beyond the pass. I watched the display as the flanking group broke away from the main Dominion line, moving with terrible speed toward the convoy's position. Our defense fleet's main formation could not simply abandon the pass to pursue them without opening the bottleneck entirely, allowing the full weight of the Dominion force through to strike at the heart of the system itself. A response force needed to break away immediately, small enough to move quickly, but strong enough to hold the flanking group back long enough for the convoy to complete its escape. I heard Elias's voice again on the command channel, and something in his tone had changed, grown sharper, more focused, the sound of a man who had already made a decision before anyone else in the chamber fully understood what was happening. The Halcyon and 3 escort vessels are breaking formation to intercept the flanking group, he said. We can hold them long enough for the convoy to clear the system boundary. An officer near me argued against it immediately, pointing out that 4 vessels against the strike group's numbers would face devastating odds, that the mathematics of the engagement made survival unlikely at best. I heard Elias's response clearly, and I have carried the calm certainty of his voice with me every day since. The convoy has families aboard who cannot defend themselves. We can. That is the calculation that matters here, not the odds. I watched the display as the Halcyon and its escorts broke away from the main formation, moving to intercept the flanking group before it could reach the fleeing convoy. I do not have adequate words to describe what it felt like to watch that small cluster of markers move directly into the path of a force many times its size, knowing that the man I loved stood at the heart of that decision, having chosen, without hesitation, to place himself between danger and people he had never even met. The engagement that followed unfolded across what felt like an eternity, though the recorded logs later showed it lasted only a matter of minutes. The Halcyon and its escorts held the flanking group at the edge of the convoy's escape route, buying precious time as the transport vessels accelerated toward the safety of the system boundary. I watched reports come through of damage sustained, shields failing, one escort vessel lost entirely, the numbers growing worse with each passing moment, and still the convoy had not yet cleared the boundary that would place them beyond the Dominion's reach. Elias's voice came through the channel one final time, and though the words themselves were purely tactical, coordinates and instructions meant to guide the remaining escorts, I could hear beneath them something that told me he understood exactly what continuing to hold that position would cost him. "Convoy at 80% clearance," he reported. "Hold the line. We finish this together." The convoy crossed the boundary into safety moments later, every transport vessel accounted for, every family aboard those ships granted the chance to reach a future that Elias and his crew had purchased for them, with a cost I was only beginning to understand as the sensor display showed the Halcyon's shields finally failing entirely. I do not remember standing up from my seat in the observation chamber. I only remember finding myself pressed close against the display, watching as the ship's core, no longer protected by any shielding, began to destabilize under the continued strain of the engagement. I heard someone in the chamber say the word evacuation, heard others respond that the timing made a full evacuation impossible, given how close the enemy vessels remained, and somewhere in that exchange I understood, with a clarity that felt like ice moving through my chest, that Elias had chosen to remain aboard, coordinating what defense remained possible rather than abandoning the crew members who could not evacuate quickly enough themselves. The Halcyon's core breach registered on the display as a small flash of light, followed by the ship's trajectory shifting sharply downward, pulled by the gravity of the nearest planetary body into a steep, uncontrolled descent through the outer atmosphere. I watched the marker that represented that ship streak across the display in a long, burning arc, trailing light behind it, the way a falling star trails fire across a night sky, brilliant and terrible and impossibly brief. I do not know how long I stood there watching that light fade into the atmosphere below. Time seemed to have stopped meaning anything at all. I only remember the sound of my own voice, distant and strange to my own ears, saying his name over and over, as though repetition alone might somehow reach across the distance and pull him back from wherever that burning light had carried him. The chamber around me had fallen into a hush that felt entirely separate from the continuing battle still displayed on the other screens, where the main formation continued to hold the pass against the weakened Dominion force, now reeling from the loss of their flanking group and beginning, slowly, to retreat from the engagement entirely. Officers spoke around me in hushed, careful tones, offering words of comfort that I could not fully absorb, because every part of my awareness remained fixed on the fading light that had once been a ship carrying the only human I had ever loved. My people do not grieve the way I found myself grieving in that chamber. We are taught to hold sorrow with composure, to allow it to settle slowly rather than break through us all at once. But what moved through me in those moments could not be contained by any of the customs I had been raised with. It came out in a sound I did not recognize as my own voice, raw and broken, drawing looks of quiet alarm from council members who had never witnessed one of their own express grief so openly. I did not care. In that moment, nothing mattered beyond the burning arc of light that had carried Elias away from me, beyond the terrible silence that followed as the display finally registered no further readings from the Halcyon's position, beyond the crushing understanding that the man who had promised to return to me, who had spoken of coming home to hear me say I loved him again, had instead given everything he had to ensure that thousands of strangers would live to see another dawn. The battle at Meridian Pass ended within the hour, the Dominion force withdrawing entirely once their flanking strategy had failed, and their main assault had been ground down by the unexpectedly fierce resistance of the combined fleet. It would later be remembered as one of the most significant victories of the entire conflict, a turning point that halted the Dominion's advance and forced them into negotiations that would eventually bring the fighting to an end. But I did not feel victorious, standing in that quiet chamber as the reports of withdrawal came through. I felt only the hollow ache of a promise unfulfilled, the terrible weight of a love that had burned as brightly and as briefly as the very star he had once told me his people resembled. Gone now, scattered across a battlefield that would remember his sacrifice long after those who witnessed it firsthand had gone as well. I stood there for a long while after the chamber had emptied around me, alone with the fading light of the display and the silence that followed it, understanding for the first time in my long life what it truly meant to lose something precious to the swift, unstoppable passage of time that my people had always claimed to understand, but which I now realized we had never truly felt until that very moment. The days after Meridian Pass blurred together in a way I still struggle to describe clearly, even now. I remember fragments more than a continuous stream of memory, the sound of official condolences delivered in careful, formal tones, the sight of my own hands folding official documents I could not truly focus on, the strange numbness that settled over me whenever someone attempted to speak with me about anything beyond the barest necessities of daily function. The council, to its credit, did not press me toward any duties in those first weeks. Even the elders who had once doubted my marriage, who had warned me against attaching myself to something they considered temporary by nature, seemed to understand that whatever they had once believed about the wisdom of loving a human, the price I had paid for that love deserved a measure of respect rather than judgment. It was a young officer, one of the few survivors from the escort vessels that had accompanied the Halcyon into that final engagement, who first came to speak with me directly about what had happened in those last minutes. Her name was Lena Ashford, and she had served under Elias's command for nearly a year before the battle, and she told me, with a steadiness I admired given how recently she herself had survived such devastation, that Elias had spent his final moments not in fear, but in absolute focus, ensuring that every possible measure was taken to protect both his remaining crew and the convoy they had been sent to defend. He never once suggested retreat, she told me, sitting across from me in the quiet receiving hall where I had first met Elias so many years before. Even when the shields failed, even when the Corps began to destabilize, his only concern was making certain the convoy crossed the boundary safely, and that as many of us as possible found our way to the evacuation pods before it was too late. I asked her, my voice barely steady, whether he had suffered in those final moments, and she told me, gently but honestly, that from everything she had witnessed, he had remained calm until the very end, focused entirely on the duty he had chosen rather than on any fear for himself. That does not surprise me, I told her. He was always like that. Even in the smallest moments of our life together, he thought of others before himself. Lena told me something else that day, something I have carried with me ever since. She said that in the final transmission before the Halcyon systems failed entirely, Elias had spoken briefly, not about tactics or coordinates, but about me, expressing a simple hope that whatever happened, I would understand that everything he had done in those final minutes had been done with the same conviction that had led him to marry me in the first place, a belief that some things are worth the full weight of whatever cost they demand. I did not sleep well for many nights after hearing that, though eventually the sharpest edge of grief began to soften into something more manageable, not smaller, but different, a weight I learned to carry rather than one that constantly threatened to crush me entirely. The victory at Meridian Pass, as I mentioned, marked a genuine turning point in the wider conflict. The Dominion, having lost a significant portion of their forward fleet and having failed to achieve the swift, decisive advantage they had expected, found themselves facing pressure from within their own ranks to pursue a negotiated resolution rather than continue a costly engagement against an alliance that had proven far more resilient than anticipated. Within several months, formal negotiations began, and though the process moved slowly, as such things always do, it eventually produced a lasting agreement that ended the hostilities entirely. I found myself drawn, in the aftermath of that victory, toward a role I had never expected to occupy. Where once I had served quietly as a liaison, translating language and custom between two peoples, still learning to trust one another, I now became something closer to an advocate, speaking before the council with a passion I had never allowed myself previously, arguing not simply for continued alliance with humanity, but for a deeper, more genuine respect for what their people had shown themselves capable of giving. I remember standing before the full council perhaps a year after the battle, addressing elders who had once dismissed humans as reckless fireflies, unworthy of true consideration as equals. I told them, in words that surprised even myself with their directness, that I had once believed, as many of them still did, that a short life meant a life of lesser value, that permanence was the true measure of worth. I told them that I had learned, through loss more painful than anything my long years had previously prepared me for, that this belief had been entirely wrong. A life measured in decades rather than centuries is not a lesser life, I told them. It is simply a life lived with a different relationship to time, one that teaches its people to act with courage precisely because they understand how little time they truly have. Elias Marr gave everything he had, not because his life meant less to him, but because he understood, more clearly than any of us ever have, exactly how much it meant, and chose to spend it protecting others rather than hoarding it for himself. I do not know if my words alone changed the minds of every elder in that chamber, but I know that in the years that followed, the alliance between our peoples grew stronger and more genuine than it had ever been during the cautious early days of our first contact. Human envoys were welcomed with a warmth that Elias himself had never fully received during his own posting, a warmth that existed, in no small part, because of the sacrifice he had made and the understanding it had forced my own people to finally embrace. There came a day, nearly 2 years after the battle, when I finally felt ready to hold a memorial for Elias, in the manner I believed truly honored who he had been. My own people's customs called for a quiet, private ceremony, minimal words, a simple placement of remembrance stones in the family garden, conducted without excessive display of emotion. Elias's own culture, as he had once explained to me, favored something different, a gathering of those who had known him, stories shared openly, laughter mixed freely with tears, a celebration of the life lived rather than only a formal acknowledgement of its ending. I chose to combine both, despite quiet disapproval from several elder council members who felt the blending of customs was inappropriate for someone of my standing. I held the ceremony in the same garden where Elias had proposed to me, where we had first spoken beneath the twin moons, where he had told me, on the eve of his final departure, that he did not regret a single day of choosing the life we built together. I invited both human diplomats and my own kin, along with Lena Ashford and several other officers who had served alongside him. We began with the quiet, formal remembrance my own customs demanded, placing pale stones along the garden path, a tradition meant to mark the passage of a soul in a manner that would remain undisturbed by wind or weather. But then, breaking from the silence that would normally have followed, I invited those gathered to speak, to share memories openly, in the manner Elias's own people practiced. Lena spoke first, describing the officer who had led with quiet confidence rather than harsh authority, who had earned the loyalty of his crew through genuine respect rather than mere rank. Other officers shared smaller memories, moments of humor, small kindnesses Elias had shown during difficult deployments, details that painted a fuller picture of the man than any formal record ever could. When it came my turn to speak, I found myself telling the gathered crowd about the evening he had proposed to me in that very garden, about his terrible cooking that he insisted was wonderful, about the games we played where he always won at his own and I always won at mine, about the quiet mornings when he would wake before me simply to watch the light change across the eastern hills, telling me once that even after years of my own people's more patient traditions had rubbed off on him, he still could not fully shake the human urge to greet each new day as though it might be his last worth living fully. I told them, standing there with tears falling freely in a way my own people rarely allow themselves in public, that I did not regret a single day of loving him either, despite everything it had ultimately cost me. I told them that if given the choice again, knowing everything that would eventually happen, I would still choose him, exactly as he had once told me he would still choose me, every single time. The ceremony ended not in silence, as my own customs would normally have demanded, but in a strange and beautiful mixture of quiet reflection and shared laughter over the memories offered, a fusion of two cultures that Elias himself, I believe, would have found entirely fitting given the life he had chosen to build between them. In the years since that day, I have continued to serve as a bridge between our two peoples, carrying forward the work Elias began during those early, uncertain days of our first meeting. I have watched the alliance between humans and my own kind grow into something far stronger than a mere treaty, something built instead on genuine mutual respect, forged through shared sacrifice that neither of our peoples will soon forget. I have also come to understand something about myself that I never expected to discover through such painful means. My people live long lives, measured across centuries rather than decades, and we have always considered this longevity a kind of strength, a wisdom born from patience that shorter-lived species could never fully achieve. But Elias taught me something my own long years had never managed to teach me on their own. That true courage often has less to do with how much time one has, and everything to do with how fully one chooses to use whatever time remains. I carry that lesson with me now, through years that stretch ahead of me far longer than the brief, brilliant span Elias was given to live. I do not know how many more centuries lie before me, but I know that whatever remains of my own long life, I intend to live it the way he taught me to, fully, courageously, without waiting for some distant, perfect moment that may never actually arrive. Sometimes, on quiet evenings beneath the twin moons, I still walk through that garden where everything between us began and ended, and I remember the way he described his own people during one of our earliest conversations together, comparing them to stars that did not need to burn forever in order to light up the sky around them. I understand now, in a way I never could have before losing him, exactly what he meant by that. Elias Marr burned briefly across my long life, brilliant and fierce, and entirely unforgettable, and though the light of that particular star has long since faded from the sky above Meridian Pass, I carry its warmth with me still, in every choice I make, in every day I choose to live as fully and as courageously as he once taught me a life, however long or short, truly deserves to be lived.